Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you all for your opening statements. I think they made for very interesting listening, and I want to thank you, Niall, for being here. And I think it's an absolute shameful disgrace that somebody in your position is at risk merely by coming before an Oireachtas committee to tell the truth about how things are. And I think that is a shame on a lot of houses, not just on successive governments. And to be in a position like that for so many PhD students and workers requires a collusion. It requires a collusion within the system that people have to stand up and speak out about. And the answer to that is not student fees or student loans. We must dig much deeper within ourselves to find the answers to that, of why that has been allowed to happen. And probably my first question, I have a number of questions, but my first question would be to you in terms of the HEA bill, what specifically needs to be done, because I think we have an opportunity in the HEA bill that we won't have presented to us again to address some of these issues, and the funding being conditional on not allowing this absolutely abhorrible situation to continue. Otherwise, we have all failed. I do want to give you an opportunity to talk a bit more about the capitalist model, because I have great concerns that the route we are going down in terms of the future funding model is the capitalist route, and I see different things creeping in along that I haven't time to discuss today that really need to be addressed as well. In terms of loans, I think what we haven't said that yes, there are individual returns, absolutely, social returns, returns to employers, and that needs to be balanced out. But there are billions of unpaid student loans internationally. There's a huge administrative burden with that, and most of these loans end up getting written off. So when we think further along in terms of student loan model, I would absolutely be against it, and to be associating education, such a key public good, with debt rather than investment, I think requires a deeper analysis there. And we know that again, when you take along that route, we see that many of the grants are then replaced with loans. So I wouldn't like this committee to go down the route of thinking that the loans, student loans, are the panacea for so many things that need to be addressed. I want to ask IBEC in terms of the measurement of the risk to the Irish economy if we don't immediately address the chronic underfunding within the higher education system. I want to ask ISME and IBEC in terms of the 817 million in the National Training Fund at the beginning of 2021, and the 817 million of unspent funds when we're here discussing the underfunding of higher education. Now, on top of that, the reserve, it's not designed to be counter-cyclical because of EU fiscal rules, would not allow it to be. But these rules were suspended during COVID. So there has been a window of opportunity to access the reserve without a corresponding reduction in exchequer funding. And what I want to ask is, how do you view the fact that the reserve has been allowed to build up to 817 million and would reach 1.4 billion by 2005 as if spending remains the same? I need to ask you, Emer, as well, in terms of mental health. So, some of you have referred to it. I'm really concerned because there are bits of money given. There was some money given during COVID, which absolutely welcome. Then there was as sometimes happened, then there's the illusion giving that there was extra funding this year when it was really the funding from last year that was continued. Again, all very welcome. But we don't have a situation where the third level institutes can employ them and employ the psychologists and the mental health supports that are needed. Rather, we're kind of buying these things in on an ad hoc basis. That is not the way to really address the severe mental health problems that we have within our third level institutes, and that if not addressed at that stage will have an impact on the wider economy as well as individuals going forward. A lot of questions, sorry.
I want to start off with Mr. McDonald. McDonald. So, Deputy, two things. Firstly, just on in relation to student loans, and this is not something that Mr. Donoghue and I would coordinate on in IBEC, but we would recognise, we certainly, on the one hand, would agree with what Tony has said about the need for some level of student loan, but we're not, certainly on our side, we would not be talking about anything that looks like the US system of student loans, for example, which I think is the concern you might have. It's something that puts an economic value on something, as Esri has said, that is actually hugely valuable to the individual, and it solves the allocation problem. How do you allocate very valuable resource if you don't apply some sort of economic value to it? On your question on the National Training Fund, obviously it has been a matter of concern to us that the level that fund has been expanding of late, and it's almost certainly going to break €1 billion this year. That needs to be spent on higher education, but not on. It must be spent on workplace learning as tertiary education, and I don't mean this in any derogatory way, but not within academia. This needs to go to workplace learning. This needs to go to lifelong learning. This needs to go to continuous professional development. We have given one example within the Blue Cert, which is learning which we've very clearly identified is absent in the among the owners of small businesses. Really significant levels of ignorance of health and safety law, labour law, working time directive, payment of wages act, very, very basic stuff that is absent among tens of thousands of small business owners. So that's where we should be spending that money, because it is the employers that are paying for that. It would be a huge mistake to subsume that into the wider education budget. That's it from me, Chair.
Yeah, I agree. Everything that Mr. MacDonald's just said in relation to the NCF. I mean, I was never actually convinced of the arguments around the EU fiscal rules either at the time. This is unspent money that was earmarked, collected from employers to be spent on upskilling in the workplace, and that's how it should be used. There are lots of really good programs. I can think of SkillNets, for example, which is an employer-led upskilling program, which are underfunded, and yet the money's still sitting there. It doesn't make any sense to me. Just on that student loan model, I think it's important that we get back to first principles on this. I think anybody with the motivation and aptitude to pursue higher or indeed further education should be enabled to do so. That's the starting point. And there should be a grant system there that supports people, because we know it's not actually now an issue of just fees, it's the other costs associated. And we've got the worst of both worlds now. We've got €3,000 contribution from half the student population, or more accurately their families. That, particularly if you have more than one child, and you've got a number of young people in the family going to third level, that doesn't cover those costs. We've got an underfunded system, so we've got the worst of both worlds, as I say. I don't, and I think it can be totally funded by the state. I think if we require excellence, which is another way of ensuring industry involvement, benefactor investment, research investment, is if you have excellent institutions. And that brings me on to your specific question around measurement of risk. You can't put numbers around this. There's some contestable ones, like the rankings, which, you know, people can quite cogently argue against them, but they're there, and they damage our reputation, as I suggested in the opening remarks. When companies look at the education profile of Ireland, we've got high progression rates to higher education. That's great. But if we look at our institutions and they're not performing well, and that is in terms of one of the key metrics of that is staff-student ratio. And if the staff-student ratio has actually decreased fundamentally from, I think it was 17 per 1 down to 21 per 1, that again is another metric that's out there. None of these metrics are perfect, but they build a picture, and over time, and this is it, it's not like a crisis in the health sector, for example, and it doesn't capture the headlines like trolleys and waiting lists, but it's no less invidious. It just takes a longer period of time for the results of this underinvestment to be shown.
Yep.
Tony has covered the student loan issue very well, so I won't take time on that. On the mental health issue, yeah, I absolutely agree that it's not an issue of ad hoc supports. We need embedded supports, from kind of broad brush supports for many to more intensive supports for the few who need them within institutions. But there are broader issues there around child, adolescent and adult community mental health services and the underfunding. Sharing the division mental health policy has a lovely vision of the kind of covering the spectrum of supports, but really that requires a very significant investment. I would have very great concerns, given the patterns we saw with the Growing Up in Ireland study, that those young people will experience scarring effects that will predispose them to mental health difficulties going forward, and therefore impact on their education outcomes, their employment outcomes, their health and well-being. So I think it is a matter of urgency if we see that over half of the 22-year-old women are experiencing kind of above the depression threshold. It's very concerning.
Thanks, Deputy. I just want to thank you for your comments on the Dáil in this issue and precarity. You're one of the few people that asks the right questions. But when I read the answers of the Minister to you, I see that often he says, well, it's up to institutions to set their own priorities, okay? But yet when we ask the institutions as their staff, and we don't have much of a voice, they often say, well, it's government that's not giving any money. So I detect a kind of a passing of the buck back and forth. I think that's a major problem here, which the committee should address. You're absolutely right in terms of solutions. I think that built into this forthcoming bill, there should be targets for a drawing down of precarity overall. And also I think we should go back to the Cush report, which said that core modules where there's an ongoing need every year should not be taught by people that are hourly paid. But today they are, and it's happening, as far as I know, in every institution in Ireland. So I think this kind of conditionality in this mechanism should indeed be built into the bill. Thank you.
Okay.